Are you able to hear me properly?
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So first, I would like to acknowledge the fact that it's just amazing how you guys have arranged the conference. It's just amazing. So I would like to thank and congratulate all of you, particularly Dr. Lady, who has been in contact with me for a while, and I'm sure with all the other speakers arranging this great virtual conference. It's not absolutely not easy, but I mean, everyone, the whole team has done an amazing job. So I'm very delighted to be here, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone on board. So let me start sharing my slides. So today, what I mean, going to talk about is the real world evidence in health economics and outcomes research. Now, if you are not very familiar with what the real world evidence is, it's commonly very commonly known in our world as the RWE, or I mean the real world evidence. And throughout my presentation, I will show you, like, what is the I mean, first we'll understand what is RWE, or real world evidence, and its importance. Then, what are the different sources from where we get this real world evidence? Then, what are the different challenges when we are using these different types of real world evidence, and how do we overcome them potentially? And then, the observational studies, which are at the core of this RWE, how do we evaluate them? So, we'll go through each one of them. And just one housekeeping thing I wanted to mention is that there will be a few participation questions, and it's not like a poll that I have developed with Zoom, but please feel free to put that in the chat, and then when we are in the discussion session, we can certainly talk about them, and happy to answer any questions. So first, let's start with what is RWE and why is it important. So what is RWD? So I have mentioned about RWE. Now we are talking about RWD, which is the real world data. Now using this real world data, we actually get to the RWE, or the real world evidence. And before we go into that, the two, if we broadly classify this, different types of evidences, the two sources are, one is which is coming from the randomized control trial, which is what you see here as RCTs, acronymed here, and the other one is from the data which does not come from RCTs. Now, RCTs are considered to be the gold standard, mainly because of the randomization that is associated with RCTs, and you need an RCT pretty much to get any a drug to get approved, right? But in nowadays, we'll see throughout the presentation how RWE is also enhancing this process, and sometimes even trying to replace it. It's not quite there yet, but there definitely have been some great strides towards it. Now, broadly speaking, RWD, or the real world data, are essentially the data which are collected outside the RCTs, which are not from the randomized controlled trials. And it is collected, or routinely generated or collected in the course of healthcare delivery system. So for example, when we go to the different sources of RWD or RWE, you'll see, we have different types of sources, and I will explain each one of them and how it is really helpful to generate the evidence. And I remember Dr. Shetty mentioning about the outcomes portion. So, in general, when I talk about the health economics and outcomes research aspect, not specific to RWE, I explain how we define outcomes. But just to briefly mention, just because we were talking about that, is we have something called the ECO model, ECHO model. It stands for economic, clinical, and humanistic outcomes. So outcomes can be many different types. It can be either looking from an economic standpoint, it can be from a humanistic standpoint, like patient-reported outcomes, and all clinical outcomes, like HbA1c values, lipid profile, which is surrogate outcomes, or hard clinical outcomes such as hospitalization or mortalities and things like that. So all this, and I cannot agree more with Dr. Shetty that and not under, I mean, without understanding the importance or how the outcomes are being influenced by the different types of interventions that come into the place in in our world, we don't exactly know what is going on. So we always need to do this kind of outcomes evaluation. Now, some of the examples of RWD, right? So first we have the electronic health records, or EHR. Now, EHR is, it's very rich. It's a very rich clinical resource. So there, I mean, when in the United States, when we work on with different data, one of the most used data is the administrative or claims database. Now, electronic health records are considered to be even better in some ways, because they will most oftentimes be associated with lab values and certain other data elements which are not available in other types of data sources. So electronic health records are very rich in that way. And there are many different types of electronic health records. Trinetics, they have their own health EHR system. They, I mean, a pool of data. Then if you go to certain hospital systems, they have their own electronic health records. So when you have an encounter, it gets recorded within these electronic health records. So, and then, people, researchers like us, we can go in and see, what kind of medications or certain other types of intervention, diagnostic tools and everything are associated with outcomes. Whether the patient who is taking a certain medication is staying longer in the hospital, or, getting re-hospitalized within 30 days, 30-day rehospitalization. All right. So what type of things are going on? We can essentially look into that. So that's your electronic health records. The next is administrative or claims data. Now, there are certain I mean, particularly this type of data is not, I don't really think is really available in India, mainly because it is very much associated with the claims or insurance companies. In the United States, it's very complex. The whole insurance systems is very complex. We have private insurance, we have public insurance, we have self-insurance. There are many different types. But whenever, let's say you have an insurance, you use that insurance to pay for your medical visits or your pharmacy claims or your lab visits. So whenever you do that, it gets recorded, and they have a pool of that whole thing. For, let's say, for patient X, they have 30 different claims. 10 maybe for medical diagnosis or some medical conditions, 10 maybe for different prescription drugs, and the 10 different maybe for lab values. Now, when you put all of those together, you see for one patient what is really going on moving forward. Like, if you try to follow them, as long as they're within that health insurance data or the insurance system, you can always see what's going on with them. So this is like one of the most frequently used data sources, and pharma companies use them a lot to see, and there are like big players like Humana, Aetna, who have their insurance. They look into their insurance system to see what kind of utilizations are going on. This is very important to understand who are the high users, what are their characteristics, who are using it much less, what are their characteristics, and how we can make sure that people who are high users can really benefit with certain kinds of interventions to reduce them, but have a better health outcomes. That's always the goal. Patient is the focus, right? The other forms are patient registries. These are very unique. There can be collaborations like across the globe. For example, there are certain multiple sclerosis databases, both from a clinical standpoint or their patient standpoint, like to see how their quality of life is going on and all. So there, I mean, I know one database where data from different countries like Australia, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, they all come together for creating an MS data pool for multiple sclerosis for patient registries, which are huge. But please keep in mind that each one of these databases have their own limitations and advantages, right? But given the time for today's presentation, I won't be able to go into them, but happy to chat later on. The other form of real world data are patient generated informations, right? Like diaries, questionnaires, and all. So if you give them questionnaires, they fill that out, you can analyze them. Diaries are really rich sources. If there are certain patients who are able to record all their daily conditions in their diaries, that can be a really rich resource. Nowadays, smart devices like in-home monitoring devices, apps on phones, they can be like real-time data, so they can provide much better information regarding what you are doing, like how many steps have you taken today, right? If you have a Fitbit around your wrist, they can calculate like how many steps you have taken on that day. Are you meeting the goals that you have set for yourselves? And they can be and the company can be having a whole real-time data to analyze them. So that smart devices have created a whole different set of real-world data. And last but not the least, is the social media, Twitters, Facebook. These are like immense sources of social media data. I was at a conference when I was at an assistant professor in University of Arizona. There they had a conference where they were talking about this research using Twitter, where they were trying to clean the data. Like they're trying to see like asthma, asthma attacks in different parts of the country, and they had to do certain kind of data cleaning. Like some tweets will be like, I had an asthma attack when I was in the Justin Bieber concert. So that's certainly not a actual asthma case, but you can actually see, whether a certain uh, environmental condition or certain weather conditions or certain things like that were associated with this kind of asthma attacks. So that's where this kind of social media data can be really helpful. Now, here comes the real world evidence. The inferences which are derived from real world data through application of trusted scientific and statistical research methods are our real world evidence. Now, these are immensely important, right? Because they can conduct safety surveillance of medical products. And I'm sure that, Dr. Saigudi will be talking a little bit about that. Then we can assess whether there are changes in treatment patterns. So we can see 10 years before, in a certain time period, let's say 10 years back, there were certain types of medications that were being used for a certain disease state. Now there has been a lot of new medications which has come into the market. How has the practice pattern changed? So we can actually assess that to see how physicians are prescribing them, how patients are taking them, and stuff like that, to assess the treatment patterns. And it is one of the most important. Another important part is it's relevant for regulatory decision making by addressing the questions that are infeasible to address to the traditional clinical trials. I'm sure that people who are familiar with randomized control trial, they can understand that there are so many strict inclusion exclusion criteria that it does not reflect. It cannot be generalized. It does not reflect what might be going on in the general settings. This real world evidence is where this is the benefit of real world evidence. It is very generalizable, and it tells you what is really going on out there in the world. So we've already talked about this. So some of the things that we are going to talk about is what are the different types of studies that are out there which can be used to generate this real world evidence. So we'll talk about pragmatic clinical trials, observational studies such as case control cohort studies, and see what are their advantages and disadvantages and so on. Let me pause for a quick second and ask all the participants if there are any particular question for me at this point that I can answer.
Sir, I have a question, sir, if that's
Yeah.
okay with you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about real-world social data, which is a new concept to me. Can you
Mhm.
just elaborate on how we could use social media data, since we are in an age of social media and everything is around social media? So how could we really apply that to the Indian scenario in a clinical context? How could we use that for our research?
Sure, that's a great question. So, for example, if you take the same question regarding asthma attacks, and if you, so here is a thing about it. Not every user, so for example, if I have let's say someone has an asthma attack, he or she may not put it in the social media and say like, I am having this problem. There can be certain other things, stigma associated with that. But people who do, you can definitely do certain types of data cleaning and see what is really going on, how many people are really reporting that in the certain time period, and you can see whether there is a seasonal effect, whether there is a effect of, let's say, whether northern India is really different from southern India in this type of attack, same east
Right.
versus regionally, and so on and so forth. So you, depends on what question you want to ask. That's the
Okay.
case. But you can always look into this type of things and use this real-time data to answer all those questions. So it's very intuitive and very interesting, but can be challenging at times to do that. And to process this big data, that's a whole different discussion. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for answering that.
so, I can take one more question if there is any other question, and then I can move on.
If the participants have any questions, I think they can put their questions in the chat box. Yeah. Any queries that you want to ask Dr. Sandeepan, sir?
Okay, no worries. I mean, we will have some hopefully some time to have some discussion, question
Yes,
answer.
sir.
So So RWE, why do we really need it, right? That's the question. Now, patients nowadays are living longer and wanting the best possible health. So if you are familiar with, let's say, let's talk about the area of oncology, right? Cancer patients are surviving more. But the question is whether they have a better quality of life when they're surviving, whether they're able to get access to the treatments that they need. They are able to participate in the social life and all. So the quality of life is very important here, right? So we need those kind of evidence for that. Now, costs continue to rise, and we need to demonstrate the value to the payer. Now, remember, this value is a very important concept nowadays. Value-based care, value-based contracting, and all, which is very big hot topic here in the U.S. because there are, I mean, so many products are coming out, and the cost. If you look at the cost curve in the U.S. and I'm pretty sure in the whole world, it's ever increasing, right? So there needs to be certain ways, and the payers are always trying to find some ways in which they can reduce the cost, but at the same time provide best care for their patients, right? So the companies who are coming up with this kind of products, whether it's a medical, drug, whether it's a device, some other form of intervention, they need to demonstrate that what they are doing has some value to it, right? So that's what is very important, and this comes from your real world evidence. The other important thing is regulatory agencies. Like, there is this 21st Century Cures Act, which was from the FDA, which requires FDA to develop a framework and guidance for drug approvals using RWE. Now, drug approvals are usually not done without RCTs. These are additional indications for an existing drug. So you can actually get our FDA approval using real world evidence. There has been a case of Ibrance, which was approved for male breast cancer treatment just based on RWEs. So this has been shifting the regulatory decision making, right? So this is really, really important that way. Now, pharmaceutical industry needs RWE to address the effectiveness, value, and safety of their products. Whenever a pharma company is trying to bring a new product in the market, they need to first demonstrate what is the unmet need in the for that area. Like, why is it really needed? How effective is that? And
Yeah.
how do you see the value of it, right? And how safe are those products in real world? And this is where the RWE, or the real world evidence, comes into play, right? So this is like very important. And as I mentioned before, like, payment or reimbursement models, these are all from the payers. And when let's say payers, it's the insurance companies, the third party payers, who are actually people who are insured, who are going to their insurance company asking them to pay, and also the people who are actually bringing those products need to show the value, like why they will prefer their products over some other competitor product,
Right.
right? So yeah, so for today's presentation, we we don't have too much time about the decision analysis, but decision analysis includes decision tree analysis, Markov model, Monte Carlo simulation. So cost effectiveness analysis, cost minimization analysis, cost utility analysis. There are many different types of pharmacoeconomic analysis, including cost of illness analysis, um, which can be done. I mean, cost of illness is a little different, but other types of cost pharmacoeconomic studies, it can be done using this kind of decision analysis. However, we'll talk about the pragmatic clinical trials and the observational studies. So pragmatic clinical trials, right? And I have talked a little bit about RCTs when I began started my presentation. So let me pose this question to the participants: what characteristic of pragmatic trials is similar to the explanatory or the randomized controlled trial, the traditional randomized controlled trials? Whether it's a study duration, randomization, or the strict inclusion exclusion criteria. And you can just mention, I mean, answer A, B, C, put it in the chat box, and someone can please tell me like what is coming out to be the most selected answer. Let's give it maybe 30 seconds or so.
All participants could respond. I think sir is making a really good effort to make this as interactive as possible. Um, so anything that you all think about, it might be a new concept for you all, but I think we can all discuss.
Okay, so let's move on. I cannot see the responses,
We
but
have a few responses, sir.
what do they say in general? Like which one?
Uh, I think we have Dr. Uday who has said B. We have inclusion, exclusion, randomization, C, B. So I think we've covered almost every option except A.
No. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, Dr. Materi is right. It's the randomization, because keep in mind that, as I mentioned before, this part, randomized control trial, RCTs, is considered to be the gold standard of evidence. When you look at the hierarchy of evidence, at the top you have the systematic review, meta-analysis of randomized control trial, and right after that, in terms of original research, RCTs are considered the gold standard.
right,
Okay, so the most important component is the randomization. Now, without randomization, when we talk about the observational studies, they lack randomization, right? So, because of that, we have to correct for those kind of selection bias issues, which I'm going to talk briefly about those things as well. But randomization helps ensure the fact that the two groups are as compatible. I mean, pretty much similar, and the error term, the unobserved characteristics are as minimal or as similar between the two groups as possible. So that's the beauty of randomization. Now, pragmatic clinical trials is a very interesting type of clinical trial. It is not your traditional RCT, but it combines the good characteristics of RCTs as well as the real world observational studies. So, for example, it combines the advantages of randomization because pragmatic clinical trials, they have the randomization component. So there is very high internal validity. So we can trust the findings that are coming out from these pragmatic clinical trials. And the observational research ensures the high external validity, meaning that let's say you have a sample, right, where you are conducting this study in the pragmatic clinical trial, you can extrapolate those findings to the similar population. So the generalizability issue, where you can generalize the findings to the bigger population, is very high. So it has the best of both worlds and perhaps provides one of the strongest evidences in pragmatic clinical trials. Now, some of the key points to keep in mind These are also called effectiveness trials that include randomization. Most important or the key point of pragmatic clinical trial. They treat patients in general practice settings, so in real world. So that's why this is a part of your real world evidence. They study patients demographically similar to general population. Demographic means age, gender, race, ethnicity, and certain those type of characteristics. So they can be very similar. And then they compare active treatments typically provided by typical hospitals, outpatient settings, and practitioners. It is not really a placebo controlled trial, so it's always active. Now, obviously, it has some disadvantages. It is often restricted to measuring easily ascertained and adjudicated outcomes. Some trials do not collect cause specific outcome measures. So, this is a big drawback. They are slow and expensive. Some of those pragmatic clinical trials can take years to complete and millions of dollars to get it done. So, these are big hindrances, and they lack blinding, which is an important part in your randomized controlled trial. So these are some of the key disadvantages of your pragmatic clinical trial. Now, I mean, I'm not going to go too much into it, but here is an example which the participants can look up later on. The Promise trial, which was published in New England Journal of Medicine, which is an example of your pragmatic clinical trial, and you can see how they have done it, how they have randomized the different settings and all. So this will be very interesting read for everyone. So now we need to move on to our observational studies. Now, please note that observational studies are very frequently conducted and very often kind of relied by pharma companies, the payers, and everyone. So it's very important that we understand these different concepts of observational studies. Now, the first one is, in cohort study, we have two different types of cohort studies. One is prospective cohort study, another one is retrospective cohort study. In prospective cohort study, if you look at this timeline, this is where the investigator is in present day, right? So and then we move forward in the future. So let's say that here is the investigator and looking at community dwelling elderly individuals, and then we have we don't really go too much into the past, and here we do the screening and see who were exposed to the use. This is just an example. We are looking at who were exposed to the use of second generation antipsychotics, and who were not. And then who we are looking at the outcome, the clinical outcome, new cases of metabolic disorders which are often associated with antipsychotics, who got them among those who used, and who got them among people who did not use, and we move forward in that. So the cohort should be disease free at the beginning. So there, people who are taking those antipsychotics, they should not have any metabolic disorders when they were screened. If they had, they would be removed from the study. We collect the same baseline information from all subjects. Then we obtain accurate information about exposures before the disease really developed. Then patients can be longitudinally followed. This is the most important component, right? We can follow them up and see what is happening with them and determine if and when they contract the disease and whether exposure status changes, whether they stopped using it or they started using it, things like that. And investigators can actually use this data to answer questions about association between risk factors and disease outcomes. So whether you took the medication and you got the disease, what is the association between that, right? So this is what your prospective cohort study is about, where you prospectively follow them up. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of your prospective cohort study. So it can indicate the temporal sequence between the exposure and the outcome. This is really important, which is a big drawback for your retrospective cohort study. Because we are able to follow them up for a very long time, hopefully we can say that, okay, this is how the sequence happened. We can evaluate multiple effects of a single exposure. I mentioned about metabolic disorders, right? You can look into hospitalization risks, you can look into mortality, you can look into EPS syndrome, you can look at many different aspects of it. So that's the beauty. More efficient for rare exposures and outcomes with long induction and latency period. Now, metabolic disorders can take a long period of time to really develop. So, if you have a short time frame to follow them up, it's not going to help you. You need a longer time frame, longer follow up time. So, this is where prospective cohorts is important. So, it will depend on what you really want to achieve, your goal, your aim of the study, the aim, the goal. So, that's how you can decide whether you go prospective cohort or you can do retrospective cohort. Now, some of the disadvantages, of course, associated are they're expensive, super expensive. And I will give you an example in the next slide. Time consuming, it can take a very long time. And this is something we call attrition bias or loss to follow up. Because as we move forward, some patients will keep starting dropping off,
Yeah.
right? So that's a big disadvantage of the prospective cohort. Now, this is an example of a landmark study, which is the nurses' health study. You can look this up again. This is a example I'm providing. And if I can remember correctly, there has been like three different waves of nurses' health study, and it started in the 70s and still going on to collect so many different across generations to collect data for women's health, to look into that. And it has been estimated like somewhere around 625 million dollars that has been invested for this study. You can understand, for prospective study, it can be really expensive, but the information that you get is amazing. It's really important. So that's where the importance of prospective course really lies. The next type of observational study is the retrospective cohort study. Now, if you look at the timeline, right? So this is where we are investigators present. Everything has already happened in the past, right? So basically, let's say that what we do with this kind of studies is we analyze existing secondary data which has already been collected. Maybe your electronic health records, EHR data, or mostly your administrative or pharmacy claims data. So let's say that in January, from January 1 to June 30th, 2004, we had a washout period. Then the exposure period started, where within this time frame, people started using the particular medication, whether it's antipsychotic, antidepressant, stimulants, or whatever different type of medication, right? And then once they started using it, you start following them up. Let's say minimum for 24 months, and then you see what kind of outcomes develop in the exposed group, which started using the particular medication of interest, and what happened in the unexposed group, who never started using that medication, and you compare the risks associated with taking this medication versus not taking this medication, right? But again, the timeline is everything has already happened. We are
Yeah.
retrospective about analyzing the data. So all events, exposure, latent period, and subsequent outcome have already occurred in the past. Uses existing data, example, as I said, claims data, EMR or EHR, to identify the population and the exposure status. The outcome of interest or the disease state is determined at present time, whether you're doing it or not during the follow-up. Now, this is, these are all very nutshells, and how this, I mean, to introduce you guys to this type of studies, if you all don't already know, this can be a whole lecture when we talk about pharmacoepidemiology and all. So, what are the advantages of retrospective cohort study? They can study multiple outcomes, same as prospective cohort study. You can look at many different types of outcomes. They are less expensive compared to prospective cohort studies. Within like 200 $250,000, you can do a lot using retrospective cohort study. It's less time consuming because the data is already there. The main part is to design the study and analyze the data, and then look at interpret the data. So that's very less time consuming. But there are a lot of disadvantages associated with this retrospective cohort study. Selection bias, which is a big problem, misclassification or information bias, challenging to assess temporal relationship. Now, when we look back, we don't always know how the sequence really happened, right? Some due to some errors, they may not have been recorded. Something may have happened in between. It's very challenging.
Yeah.
It relies on others for accurate and difficulty. It's difficult to compare exposures to molecules because they can interchange and may require very large sample sizes for rare outcomes. Because without that, you don't have the power to analyze the data or to detect the differences. This is an example of a retrospective study where they were looking into serious falls injuries before and after initiating dialysis among older ESRD patients in the US. A retrospective cohort study, and I would encourage everyone to please go through this study to understand, like, how they designed it, how they adjusted for selection bias and everything. So the other type of study, which is not always used but can be very important in certain cases, is a case control study, which is very interesting. Like, we are here where we find out the disease cases, and then we have the no disease cases or the controls. The cases are your disease and controls are your no disease. You go back and look at their exposed status, whether they took that medication or they did not. The same goes for the no disease population, whether they took the medication or not, and then you calculate the risk associated with them. That's your case control study. So you can identify a group that have the disease and who don't have the disease, then assess the relationship between the risk factor and the disease by reviewing records retrospectively, going backwards, and compare the risk of exposure status in each group, right? However, this is again briefly about your case control study. What are the advantages? Good for studying rare diseases. If there are certain rare conditions, you have a case group, you find a suitable control group, and you can go back and see what kind of exposures they had. So that's really good for that. Then it requires less time, which is again because you are in the present and you can go back and see what's going on, and assess multiple risk factors or exposures, and relatively less expensive. So these are advantages. However, the disadvantages associated with them are recall bias. What happened to me 6 months before, I may not recall properly. What about 1 year before, 2 years before? So it depends. So we have that recall bias issue. The other problem is temporal relationship, the sequence, how it all happened. We may not be able to recall that properly. And then the other big challenge is to find a suitable control group. So you have a certain disease. How do you really find a control group for that? So that can be really challenging. So these are some of the disadvantages of your case control study. Now, this is a very classic example of a case control study, which was in the 1950s by the BMJ, British Medical Journal. So lung cancer rates were rising, and they suspected that coal fire fumes were the cause. So what they did was they identified patients with the suspected cancers and found that all the patients with confirmed lung cancer were smokers, and all without cancer were not smokers. So that's how they came up with the fact that smoking is obviously a big risk factor for your lung cancer. So this is, a landmark study which used a case control study where they went back and saw whether they used whether they're smokers or non-smokers, and looked at the risk. So that's how they found out, like, it was actually the smoking that was associated with this. So another quick question for the audience: what do you think is the biggest limitation associated with observational studies? Is it lack of randomization, lack of placebo control, lack of strict inclusion exclusion criteria, or lack of large sample sizes?
Sir, we have a couple of responses, and I think the majority has responded A, lack of randomization.
Okay, so I think everyone was able to follow, my harping upon the randomization issue, and that is correct. It's the lack of randomization, and you will see in the later slides, how we try to overcome this big issue with the observational studies. So, and if you don't mind, how much time do I have left? I'm not looking at the
So
clock.
you can take time. We have almost 30 minutes, 35 minutes for you.
So then we are good. Then we'll probably have some good time for discussion as well. So, Just in a nutshell, the different types of observational studies, right? RCTs, we require less sample size. Pragmatic, in between. Observational, we do require a large sample size. Duration wise, it's pretty much, in the other way around. We need much less time with observational studies. Pragmatic trial can take a long time. RCTs somewhere in between, right? Cost, pragmatic trials can be really expensive, right? RCTs were really after that. And please keep in mind that RCTs can be super expensive as well. So it's really important to understand that. And then observational studies are perhaps the least expensive among them. Now, internal validity, which is the basic scientific premise of all these different types of studies, right? Best comes from your RCTs. That's why it's considered the gold standard, the highest internal validity, followed by your pragmatic control trials. And the least comes from your observational studies, right? And external validity wise, observational studies, once you conduct in the real world, you can actually generalize it to the population. However, when you are conducting RCTs, because of all the strict inclusion exclusion criteria, it's really tough to generalize that. You take that finding and go to the people who you will actually be administering the drug to, you can see many different types of outcomes. And that's where the real world evidence is so important, right? To see how the safety is going on, what kind of outcomes they are experiencing, and stuff like that. And pragmatic trial, as I said, has the best of both worlds. It has high internal validity as well as high external validity. So its scientific premise is strong and it can be generalizable to general population. So it's really effective. But remember, it's the cost issue that is the biggest impediment here, right? So this is in a nutshell how you can visualize, the different types of studies that are from. I mean, RCT is obviously not the real world evidence, but this pragmatic and observational studies, which is your real world evidence, as compared to the gold standard, how they fare in terms of this different categories. This is very intuitive, right? So now that we know that lack of randomization is the problem, now let's see how we can assess the risk of bias. So to do that very quickly, randomized controlled trials gives us efficacy. I have always seen people interchange the term, but the correct term for randomized controlled trial is efficacy. For observational studies is the effectiveness. There is a big difference. Efficacy tells us, can it work? Right? In RCTs, we get the answer whether it will work. So for this, all this, Pfizer, Moderna, Oxford, we are getting the answer in terms of efficacy. Can it work? The important thing will be when it comes, really gets approved, comes to the general population, we will get the effectiveness and we'll say, does it work? Right? So that's the big difference between these two types of study designs. It helps in causation, it helps in correlation, association. It can never, observational studies almost can never be associated with causation, because we will never know that because of all the unmeasured confounders that are happening. It has randomization, which helps in causality, establishing causality. It's non-randomized, self-selected. So that's the problem, right? A low generalizability, high generalizability. So these are like, the quick differences between your RCTs and your real-world evidence or observational studies. Now, this non-randomization introduces the risk of bias. This is where it becomes really tricky, right? So, but the question is, can we overcome this? That's always the question, right? So before we actually go into the different methods in which we can really mitigate that, first let's understand what is bias. So it is defined as a systematic error or deviation from the truth in results or inferences. So if your data is biased, you will see that due to the systematic errors, it will be diverted towards a particular side, whether it's on the higher end or on the lower end. Because of the bias issue, it will be systematic. I mean, there will be a systematic error. This bias is not random error. That is, it's not a matter of chance. It is something much more than that, which is non-random, and it threatens the validity of the study. So once the your st- I mean, if the validity is not there for a study, you can never rely on it, because if you're not able to establish a valid study, it doesn't matter what you find. It is erroneous and misleading, right? So there are many different types of biases that can happen, but we will focus on this selection bias and confounding, which is very much important for our real world evidence. And if you look at this, the systematic differences between the baseline characteristics and the groups that arise from self selection of treatments, physician directed selection of treatments, or association of treatment assignments with demographic, clinical, or social characteristics, these are your selection bias issues. So, for example, let's say that a patient who has Alzheimer's disease, right? There are 4 approved medications from the US FDA. It can be donepezil, rivastigmine, galantamine, or memantine. Now, why patient X got donepezil versus patient Y receiving memantine, we don't know when we are looking at observational study from our real world, from a secondary data source. We'll never know. So that's what is the selection bias. Why this patient got selected for that reason, the treatment will not know. So for that, we need to control for confounders in cohort study. This is very important. And in case control study, we need to do matching, case control matching, right? So depending on your study design, these are the you know broad way to say that how we can mitigate the bias issues. Now, how do we control for this confounding and bias? We can do regression analysis, where in the analysis stage we are trying to control for your confounders. We can use propensity score matching, which is stronger, which is better, because it helps at the study design stage. And propensity score matching can be another 3 hours of lecture. I'm just giving you very broad level overviews. Or we can use propensity score as a covariate in your final analysis. I am not a big fan of that, but this is one of the methods in which it can be done. You can do stratification based on your propensity scores and risk factors. You can do stratifications. That's another way to do control for bias and confounding. Instrumental variables are, it comes from an econometric standpoint. Instrumental variable, it is it I mean some existing studies have shown that instrumental variables compared to all other types of propensity score and everything takes you to the closest approximation that you can get from an RCT. So this is perhaps one of the best methods to do, but it is very challenging to find proper instruments, right? So that's why this is not very popular, and it's also very complicated. So people, usual researchers have a hard time gripping their mind around what's going on with this. So that's why it never got too much attention, but it's very powerful if you can actually implement that. Now, other one is Heckman sample selection models, where if you have unobserved let's say that within 100 people, only 30 people had lab data. But what is different, what those 30 people that got the lab data is very important to understand, whether their outcomes will be different from those other 70 people. So in certain those cases, Heckman sample selection can be important, can be used to control for bias and confounding. Now, having said all these things, where are we going with all these things, right? For real world evidence, like guidelines and standards. So there has been some, big work that has been done to standardize this quality assessment of observational studies for decision making in healthcare. Because when you are presenting your data to your stakeholders, let's say the payers, they will, third party payers, right? They will ask you this question: how strong is your study? What did you do to adjust for selection bias? How much was your sample size? How generalizable is your study sample? All these questions will be very important to answer, right? So for decision makers, it's really important to assess the quality of observational studies. The same goes here, right? Standards and guidelines for observational studies. Quality is in the eye of the beholder. So these, you can look it up later on, but uh, the important part is there are certain guidelines like strobe checklist. STROBE checklist. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it is very good tool to assess the quality of observational studies. Right. So when you are doing systematic review or meta-analysis of observational study, you need the STROBE checklist to do the risk of bias assessment of included studies. So that is where it's very important. Now, the stakeholders could require or even enforce the methodological standards or guideline. For example, journal editors can require them to publish. If you try to submit some article to certain big level journals like JAMA, BMJ, they will ask you to use the stroke checklist to say where in your study, which page number you have done this. So they can enforce those kind of criteria. Funders like the third party payers can require to obtain uh, can enforce this to require funding. Payers, CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and other payers, they can also require to obtain claims data to say like what standard will you be enforcing when while analyzing our data. So it's everywhere. So that is like a whirlwind presentation of your real world evidence. What is real world evidence? How are the different types of study design used? What are the different types of tools we have at our disposal to mitigate the bias, and how it is really important to moving forward for different stakeholders. So now I thank you everyone for your uh, attention, and hopefully you learned something. I am ready for any questions, comments, or suggestions.
Yes, sir. I think we have three questions for you. One is by Mr. Safal, sir, and he has asked you if cohort studies can be used for rare outcomes.
So cohort studies with rare outcomes, you will need a lot of sample size. It can be, it depends on how much sample size you really have. But the better way would be for your case control design, even though it's not very strong, but for rare outcomes, that's better way to go.
Okay. And sir, in the beginning, I think when we spoke about social media and how we could use that data, Dr. Swati has asked you if that when we use social media, isn't it difficult to interpret the opinion of people to generate a data as subject variation would be a challenge? So how can we answer that, sir?
Yes, that is a problem. So whenever you are analyzing a data, so in social media, you know, if you see certain tweet, a certain Facebook post, there can be so many different types of opinions, right? It becomes very challenging at certain time point to analyze them and to come up with a coherent, theme where you can say, okay, from this analysis, we are saying that this is what the theme is emerging, kind of analysis. So it's very difficult, and it can be challenged very frequently, but it depends on how what question you are asking, what answer you are trying to find, things like that. But it is subjective, it can be tricky.
Okay. So is there any statistical method that we can use to minimize bias in that section, sir?
Yes, I mean you can use the traditional ones. They have some a little bit different ways. This is pretty much done by management information system. Typically, in business schools, it's not very frequent in health outcome studies where people are. If you take that to a health insurance provider or a doctor, they are not going to really look at it. It will be
Okay.
more from a different standpoint, but they have their own tools to identify to address those important challenges. Yes.
Okay, okay. So, sir, this is just my thought. Like when we develop a patient information leaflet or something like that, questionnaires and things, there is scope for validation. We get it validated by maybe our patients, our doctors, and pharmacists. We use multiple techniques of validation. So, in case of social media data, like can we validate an opinion? What do you have to say about that?
Well, it will depend. Like so for example, if you are trying to validate, it depends. So for patients, so let's take your example, right? So when you develop a certain thing for certain guideline for a patient, like pamphlet for a patient, you get it mainly validated from physicians or pharmacists or healthcare providers, and also see how the patients are able to interpret that. There are some objective ways to do it, but when you
Okay.
look at tweets and all, when there is too much debate going on, it can be challenging. do that validation. We can
Okay.
still validate it, but it can be much more challenging compared to the usual thing that we
Right.
see in. So there are objective and there are subjective, opinions or the interpretations. So yeah,
Okay. Sir, I don't know if you're able to see your chat box. We have a couple of questions for you.
let me see. Chat box. Okay. Okay. So one question is, can we combine observational studies and RCTs in meta-analysis?
Yes.
Right. So my answer is no, because RCTs are very different and observational studies are very different. So I have seen some studies where they have done like used both RCTs and observational studies, but the pooling of the data has been different. So all the RCTs have been pooled together, all the observational studies have been pooled together. Now the challenge will be if there is a difference between the two findings. If the RCT says one thing and the observational study says a different thing, that's where it becomes more interesting.
Right.
But I mean, I don't think we should ever combine these two together.
Okay. Um, Shilpa ma'am, Dr. Krishna Undela would like to ask a question. He has raised a hand. Is it possible?
Sure, sure.
Name
And I see, yeah,
Krishna.
correct.
Dr. Krishna Undela, he would like to ask a question directly.
Dr. Krishna Undela, I've sent a
Yeah,
request. Yeah, unmute. Yeah.
thank you.
Can,
Thank you so
can
much.
you please start your video?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Thank you so much. Good morning and good evening to Dr. Sandipan. It's a very well presentation. We have given all the clear instructions, especially about all the real world evidence as well as observational studies. I'm sure it is going to be very useful to the audience here. My question is, I'm sure in USA is one of the country where most of the real world evidence is going to be generated from very big databases, right? So in that case, how well this real world evidence is used in terms of taking any healthcare decisions, especially in terms of economic issues, how well this real world evidence is going to be useful, especially in US case.
Sure. So in US, if you're looking from an economic standpoint, it's usually the real world data that drives it. From RCTs, you don't really get the economic evaluation. Yeah. I mean, you can do some cost effectiveness analysis alongside clinical trials, but that's very different. But if you're looking at from an economic standpoint, like for outpatient utilization, you have certain cost. For inpatient utilization, you have some associated cost. Prescription, you have certain costs. So these all come from your real world data. For example, medical expenditure panel survey maps is perhaps one of the best sources, or for economic analysis, for cost of illness analysis and stuff like that. So which is very important, and people look at it. I mean, certain things like for Humana is a big insurance company, right? So they can see like what kind of utilization patterns is happening within their enrollees and what is the cost associated with it. So that is a real world data, right? And they can see where is the problem coming from and try to address that with certain intervention, certain forms of things. However, to answer the other question that you asked, like in the US, this real world data plays a big role. Maybe not in the first approval of your drug, but in anything beyond that. Even when you go to for your value proposition, you say like the unmet need, what is going on in the real world data for similar patients, what are their characteristics, whether they are satisfied with the existing treatment, whether they are being adherent to the existing treatment. So they can all answer those questions with real world data. So this plays a very big role. But let me tell you, even though US is so fragmented, you don't have something called birth to death registry, which is very much this data sources from Denmark, Finland, and some of the big countries where you have like single payer system. They have birth to death registry where you can follow one person from their birth to death. So you can have much better real world evidence coming from those data sources as well. But in US, we do the best with what we have, from different things. And many times pharma companies will look at the different databases to answer the same research question to see if there are differences, which is also important, when you go to the payers.
I
Sure.
hope that answers your question, sir. So there's a question posted by Jayalakshmi on what type of statistical methods we could be using in retrospective cohort studies.
So for retrospective cohort study, let me share the slide. Time. So all these different types of statistical techniques can be applied to your retrospective cohort study, and many more. Actually, these are just a few of them.
Okay. Uh, so I think, sir, to conclude the talk, I'd like to ask you one question. Now, with
Sure.
the current situation now, if you weigh out prospective and uh, retrospective studies are more feasible with the current situation as of now, though they do have a lot of disadvantages in comparison to prospective studies. But yet, we need real world data, we need real world evidence, we need good quality data as well. So, what is the scope, or how could we safely conduct prospective studies currently in this scenario right now?
So first, I mean, that's a very good question, and let me tell you that there has been, from what I have heard, I am not really involved in any prospective cohort study, but I have known certain people who may have been delaying certain data collection, or
Yeah.
delaying part of their data collection because of this pandemic,
Yes.
or they are moving. So for example, it's going to telehealth. It's rather than face to face, it's
Yes.
telehealth.
Yeah.
So we can rely on certain surveys or certain other things for those kind of prospective data collection,
Correct.
which
Correct.
might be a little challenging, but still doable. It depends on what exactly the situation is. But I mean, I definitely see the issues with it, but also with this Zoom and WebEx and everything, it can still be done.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is the story of a lot of research scholars and students, with all studies being delayed because of the COVID pandemic. So, sir, I just want to extend a heartfelt gratitude for taking your time out and taking time with discussion. I think we had a couple of questions and it was very interactive. And I think interaction is a big challenge right now, with everything being made digital, with loss of eye contact, loss of personal touch, and but still you have made it. And we want to really thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. And I should have mentioned this before. So it's like Thanksgiving Day here at
Oh,
the
yes.
US. So happy Thanksgiving, happy and healthy Thanksgiving to everyone. And I'm thankful for everything. I'm thankful for this invitation. Great to be a part of this conference. And again, thanks to all of you who are in the organizing committee. And I wish you all the best for the rest of this conference. Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir. Thank you so much. So, with that talk,